Hi everyone, it's me, Taehyung. Before we begin today, I want to say thank you for being here, for taking your time to listen, to feel, and to share this moment with me. I know life is busy, I know everyone is fighting their own battles, so the fact that you're here right now means more than you think. Tonight, I want to speak honestly, not just as an artist, but as a human being. Sometimes people only see the lights, the music, the performances, and the headlines, and they forget that behind all of it, there is a real heart. A heart that gets tired. A heart that feels happiness. A heart that breaks and heals. I hope while you're listening, you don't just hear my story. I hope you feel it. I'm not here to be perfect. I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to share something real, something that changed me, something I will never forget. So sit comfortably, breathe, and let's begin this journey together. Because tonight, what happened on that stage, under the brightest lights and in front of millions of people, wasn't just television. It was a moment that reminded me what love, empathy, and connection truly mean. Thank you for being here. Now, let me tell you everything. The moment I stepped onto the Tonight Show stage, I could feel something shift inside me. The lights were warm, the audience was cheering my name, yet it all felt strangely quiet to me. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from silence. It was the quiet that comes from finally reaching a place where the truth wants to be spoken. I could feel it in my chest, like my heart had been waiting for this moment longer than I even realized. I saw Jimmy standing there smiling, arms open, and he looked genuinely happy to see me. I smiled back, but deep down I knew tonight wasn't going to be just fun and jokes. I hugged him and I felt safe for a second. Just a second, but enough to tell me I didn't have to be V from BTS. I could be Kim Taehyung tonight. We sat down and started talking. Everything began light, just like every talk show does. Music, acting, fashion, performances, topics I could answer in my sleep. And I did answer them. But each time I spoke, I felt the words coming from a different place, not from media training or rehearsed responses. Everything inside me was too full to hide behind a public persona. Then Jimmy asked a question he didn't think much about, something small and harmless. He asked about my quiet routines, morning walks, journaling, cooking alone, sitting in silence. He asked because he thought it was cute, maybe even relatable, but the moment I heard his words, something in me cracked open. Silence saved me. I didn't plan to say it. It just came out of my mouth before I had time to protect it. I felt the entire studio shift. Even though the room was still full of people, for a moment it felt like I was speaking only to myself. Jimmy lowered the cue cards, and I recognized that look on his face. He wasn't a talk show host anymore. He was someone who cared enough to really listen. So I let myself speak. I told him the truth about how even when the world loves you, you can still feel deeply alone. I said that it is possible to stand on the biggest stages in the world while feeling like your heart is collapsing backstage. I admitted that there were days when the pressure of being the strong one made it almost impossible to breathe. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't scream. They just listened. And somehow, that silence gave me permission to keep going. I told him that silence became my safe place, morning walks before the world wakes up, writing words nobody will ever read, cooking meals and eating slowly, breathing without needing to perform, simply existing instead of entertaining. I didn't share these things because I wanted sympathy. I shared them because they were real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't have to hide the parts of me that hurt. I could feel my voice trembling a little, and for a second, I wondered if I should stop. But Jimmy looked at me with eyes that said, "You're safe, I'm here, keep going." So I did. I told him about losing people, about friendships that faded because life became too fast. I talked about waking up some mornings and wishing the world would slow down just long enough for my heart to catch up. I talked about fear, not fear of failure, but fear of disappearing inside my own success. And then I looked at Jimmy, really looked, and I saw tears already forming in his eyes. That was the moment I realized something. I wasn't just speaking for myself. I was speaking for everyone who has ever felt alone in a crowded world. That's when everything truly began to change. Jimmy's eyes were already glistening, but he tried to hold himself together. I could see him fighting it, the instinct to stay professional, to keep the show light, to protect the audience from anything too emotional. But the more he tried to hide the tears, the more obvious it became that something in him was breaking too. And I understood him. Sometimes, when someone finally says the truth you've been holding inside yourself, it feels impossible to keep the walls up. I continued speaking because stopping would have been more painful than letting the emotions flow. I told him that fame didn't break me, but the loneliness that came with it almost did. I said that the world loved me loudly, but I forgot what it felt like to be loved quietly. Not as an idol, not as a global figure, but simply as a person who needed rest, comfort, and presence. The studio was so silent that I could hear the cameras moving, the soft clicks of adjustment as they searched for angles, unsure whether to feel my pain or protect it. For once, I didn't care how I looked. I wasn't thinking about how the moment would trend online or how the headlines would spin it. I was thinking about the younger version of myself, the boy who used to laugh easily and love deeply, the boy who never imagined exhaustion could come from something he adored. Jimmy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, not to interrogate me, but to get closer to feel the words, instead of just hearing them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady. He asked, "When did you start to feel like this?" It wasn't an interviewer's question, it was a human being's question. I swallowed hard, because answering meant reopening memories. I never wanted to relive on a stage like this. But I reminded myself that there are moments when honesty is the only way to breathe. So I said it. It started when I realized people loved the version of me that smiled the most, not the version of me that needed help. I could hear people in the audience sniffing quietly, not dramatic, sobbing, just the kind that comes when someone else's pain mirrors the one you've tried to ignore in yourself. I talked about the days when my phone never stopped ringing, yet somehow I felt like I had no one to call. I talked about friendships that dissolved because I was always working, always traveling, always living a life too big to maintain the relationships that used to ground me. I confessed that sometimes I wondered if people would still stay if I wasn't Taehyung, if I was just someone ordinary sitting in a small room with nothing to offer except a quiet heart. Jimmy wiped his eyes because he couldn't hide it anymore. He laughed through his tears, embarrassed and emotional all at once, and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know you were carrying so much." I took a breath, one of the deepest breaths of my life, and said softly, "I didn't know either, not until silence made me listen to myself." Something shifted in the room again. It was no longer a talk show. It was two people and an audience full of strangers experiencing a truth that most people don't speak out loud. Success doesn't protect you from heartbreak, and applause doesn't cure loneliness. For a moment, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't performing. I wasn't pretending. I looked directly into the audience and I said, "Even when you have the whole world, you can still feel like you have no one." A single tear rolled down Jimmy's cheek, and the entire studio inhaled at the same time. It was like every person there knew exactly what that sentence felt like in their own life. I sat there, breathing slowly, letting the vulnerability settle. For once, I wasn't ashamed of being emotional. I wasn't ashamed of being human. I wasn't trapped by silence anymore. I was held by it, and that's when Jimmy placed his hand over mine. Not for the show, not for the cameras, but because he understood, and everything after that changed even more. When Jimmy placed his hand over mine, something inside me softened, not because I needed comfort, but because for the first time in a very long time, I felt understood without having to hide anything. I wasn't being treated like a superstar. I wasn't being handled like a public figure who had to maintain an image. I was being treated like a person who had been hurting quietly for far too long. I looked at him, and he shook his head slightly, almost apologizing without saying a word. And in that moment, I realized the weight in his eyes wasn't just empathy for me, it was recognition. Whatever pain I had just spoken out loud, he had tasted it too. He asked gently, "Did you ever talk about this to anyone before?" I took a few seconds before answering because the truth wasn't simple. Not talking doesn't always mean no one cared. Sometimes it just means you didn't know how to begin. So I said, "I've tried, but every time I tried to talk about it, I felt guilty for not being happy when I had so many reasons to be." Jimmy nodded in a way that told me he understood that sentence on a level deeper than words. The audience didn't clap, didn't gasp, didn't move. They were listening like they were afraid of breaking something fragile. I continued, letting the honesty flow even if it terrified me. I told him how pressure can become invisible, how people see your achievements, your fame, your awards, your tours, but they don't see the nights when your brain won't stop flooding you with doubt. They don't see the moments backstage when you have to remind yourself to breathe before going out to smile. I told him the hardest part wasn't the schedule or the expectations, it was pretending to be okay when somewhere inside I felt like I was disappearing. Jimmy whispered, barely loud enough for the microphones to catch it, "You don't have to pretend right now." Something about those words broke me, not in a dramatic way, but in a real way, because sometimes you don't realize how exhausting pretending is until someone tells you that you can stop. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, not to hide, but to gather strength. I let myself feel instead of perform. And when I opened my eyes again, I could see tears falling down Jimmy's face quietly without shame. He said, "I wish people understood that success doesn't mean someone is okay." I felt my throat tighten because that one simple sentence, was the thing I had wanted the world to understand for so long. I told him I wasn't ungrateful. I loved my career, I loved music, I loved performing, I loved the people who supported me. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to let myself rest. I forgot how to be gentle with myself. I forgot how to ask for help. Jimmy asked, "What helped you start healing?" I smiled softly, the first real smile of the night, because the answer wasn't dramatic or complex. Slowing down, I said, letting myself be imperfect, learning that the world won't collapse if I take a breath. There was a moment of light laughter through the audience, the quiet kind that comes from shared relief rather than humor. I told him about the mornings when I watched the sunrise alone just to convince myself the world still had beauty. I told him about writing letters to myself in my journal, reminding myself that I didn't have to earn rest. I told him about rediscovering small joys, cooking, drawing, listening to old jazz records, feeling the wind through the window of a moving car. These little things, I said, became lifelines. Jimmy looked at me with eyes full of admiration, not for my success, but for my vulnerability. I could tell that he didn't just relate as a host or a fan, but as a human being who had learned to hide his own pain behind a smile. I felt safe enough to say the thing I had been avoiding the most. I thought that if I didn't stay strong, I would disappoint everyone. Jimmy shook his head with urgency, leaning closer. No, if you let yourself be human, you'll inspire people more than anything else you've ever done. That sentence hit me deeper than I expected. I wasn't trying to inspire anyone, I was just trying to survive. But maybe that was the reason it meant more. I could feel the emotional weight in the studio rising, spreading to every single person watching. It wasn't sadness, it was connection. I didn't feel ashamed of my vulnerability anymore. For the first time in years, I felt seen. And then everything shifted again when Jimmy asked the question I never expected. What were you most afraid of losing? If you stopped pretending to be okay? I froze for a moment because that question had only one answer, and saying it out loud would change everything for me, for him, and for everyone watching. When Jimmy asked me, "What were you most afraid of losing if you stopped pretending to be okay?" It felt like the entire studio disappeared. The cameras, the lights, the audience, the production crew, everything faded until it was just that question echoing inside my head. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I knew too well. The answer had been sitting inside my chest for years, like a stone I refused to touch. I looked down at my hands, not because I was ashamed, but because memories were rushing back so fast that I needed something steady to hold on to. For a moment, I could hear my heartbeat louder than anything else in the room. Finally, I lifted my head and said the truth. I was afraid that if I stopped pretending to be okay, people would stop loving me. The words left my mouth before I could soften them or hide them. They were raw and unguarded, exactly how they had lived inside me all these years. And the moment I said them, the energy in the room shifted again. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating because it was real. I continued before fear could make me shut down. I didn't want anyone to see the parts of me that were tired or insecure or sad. I didn't want to ruin the image people had of me. I thought that if people saw my weakness, they would walk away. I could see Jimmy's face fall, like my words shattered something inside him. He shook his head slowly, not out of disagreement, but out of heartbreak. Heartbreak that someone who gave the world so much still doubted whether he was enough without the mask. I told him that being loved by millions sometimes made me question whether anyone truly loved me. Not the version that performs, not the version that smiles perfectly in photos, not the version that makes the world proud, but the version that struggles, cries, falls apart, and needs help. I admitted that sometimes I felt guilty for hurting because I knew how blessed I was. I knew how many people wished for my life. But pain doesn't disappear just because other people would trade places with you. Loneliness doesn't care how successful you are. Jimmy said softly, "You don't have to earn love." I felt something inside me crack, the kind of crack that lets the light in. He continued, voice trembling with sincerity, "The people who love you will love you even more when they get to love the real you." Hearing that on live television from someone who mattered, from someone who wasn't afraid to cry while saying it, made something inside me loosen that had been tight for years. I told him what I had finally learned. That silence showed me who stayed. When I stopped talking, when I disappeared from everything for a while, the people who truly cared reached out anyway. They didn't need a performance to love me. Jimmy wiped his eyes again, not even trying to hide his tears anymore. I could tell he wasn't emotional because I was famous. He was emotional because what I said was something he needed to hear too. I said, "I used to think love was applause. Now I know love is presence." The audience breathed out in unison, like they had been holding their breath with me. Some of them were crying, some were hugging the person next to them. Some were simply staring, remembering their own battles behind silent smiles. Jimmy squeezed my hand again, not to comfort me, but to let me know he was still here, fully present. And then he asked a question so gentle that it felt like a hand reaching into the darkest corner of my heart. "Are you still afraid of losing love? Now that you've stopped pretending?" I looked right into his eyes, and I didn't need time to think. "No," I said, "because I finally understand that the right people don't leave when you're hurting. They get closer." Tears finally rolled down my cheeks quietly, naturally, without shame. The audience didn't react loudly. They simply shared the moment with me. For the first time in my entire career, I didn't feel like I was being watched. I felt like I was being understood. And then Jimmy asked something that would take the interview to a place even deeper, a place neither of us had planned to go. "If you could speak to the version of yourself who was hurting the most, what would you say to him?" I closed my eyes because answering that would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone watching who had ever broken silently. When Jimmy asked me if you could speak to the version of yourself who was hurting the most, what would you say to him? I felt my whole body go still, not tense, not afraid, just still, like time had paused, just for me to answer. I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to see clearly. I didn't see the studio, the cameras, or the audience anymore. I saw him the version of me that I used to hide, the one I pretended didn't exist. I saw the boy who kept smiling even when his heart was hurting. The man who stayed strong because he thought the world needed him to be unbreakable. The performer who practiced happiness because it was safer than admitting he needed help. And I spoke to him out loud on live television. I'm sorry. Those two words came first, even though I didn't plan them, and once they left my mouth, everything else broke open. I'm sorry for pushing you so hard. I'm sorry for pretending you were okay when you clearly weren't. I'm sorry for shaming you, for needing rest, for needing comfort, for needing love. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I'm sorry, I only loved you when you were performing well. I'm sorry for abandoning you every time you were sad. Jimmy covered his mouth with his hand, already crying again. I didn't look at him yet. I kept speaking not to the audience, not to Jimmy, but to the younger, hurting version of myself who had waited years to be acknowledged. You didn't deserve to carry everything alone. You didn't deserve to wake up every morning trying to be strong for everyone else while no one noticed you were breaking. You didn't deserve to feel guilty for being human. My breath trembled, but for once I didn't hold it back. You didn't lose love. You lost yourself trying not to lose love. A silence washed over the studio, heavy, emotional, sacred. And then I said the words that healed me more than anything I'd ever spoken in my life. You are enough even when you're not okay. It was like my soul exhaled for the first time in years. The audience started crying softly, quietly, not because they were sad for me, but because they recognized themselves in what I said. People who suffer in silence always recognize each other. I finally looked back at Jimmy, and tears were streaming down his face without hesitation. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't staged. It was real. He whispered, "You're helping so many people right now, you know that?" But I shook my head gently and said, "I didn't say it to help people. I said it because it's the truth. And sometimes the truth needs to be heard out loud to stop hurting so much." Jimmy wiped his face and took a shaky breath, trying to pull himself together but failing and not caring that he was failing. He told me, "You are one of the most beautiful souls I've ever met." I smiled, not the perfect idol smile, but a real, tired, grateful smile. And then I said something that surprised even me. I hope someday I'll be able to love myself the same way people love me. That was the moment Jimmy completely broke. He didn't hide it. He didn't try to laugh it off. Tears fell freely and the audience reached for tissues, hugging each other, leaning their heads on shoulders. The emotion in the room was overwhelming, yet somehow warm. And then, for the first time in the whole interview, the audience applauded. Not suddenly, not loudly, but softly, like a room full of people telling someone, "We're here, we hear you, you matter." I felt something shift deep inside me, not relief, not victory, healing. And I thought that was the emotional peak of the night. But then Jimmy placed his hand on his chest and said, "Taehyung, I need to share something with you too." I didn't expect it. The audience didn't expect it. No one expected Jimmy to become vulnerable next. But he did. The commercial break ends and suddenly the studio lights shift again. The applause sign starts flashing. The crowd begins cheering. And we are right back on air as if nothing emotional ever happened. But everything has changed. Jimmy's eyes are still a little glossy, and I know mine are too. It's one of those moments where you try to pull yourself together, but your heart refuses to return to normal. Jimmy inhales deeply, composing himself, and says, "Welcome back to the Tonight Show." And yes, we're still trying not to cry. The audience laughs, but it's that soft laugh, the kind that understands pain and love mixed together. I can tell everyone felt the moment we shared. He turns to me and asks, "Taehyung, how do you manage to hold all of that emotion and still continue performing, smiling, working?" I take a second before answering. The cameras are on me, but I don't want to filter my words. I think I hold on because of love, I say slowly. When things are heavy, I remember that there are people who believe in me. Army, my members, my family. I don't want to let them down. Even when I'm tired, I always want to give something back. The audience goes quiet. Even the band seems to stop moving. Jimmy looks at me carefully. He's emotionally invested now. This is no longer an interview. It feels like two human beings finding comfort in each other's vulnerability. He says softly, "You know, Taehyung, sometimes people forget you're still young. You've lived so much life already. And what you do for the world, that can be overwhelming." I can feel my throat tightening again, but I smile. "Maybe," I say, "but I also receive so much love that it feels worth it." Jimmy nods slowly and shifts the conversation, not to escape the emotion, but to deepen it. "What do you want the world to remember about you?" he asks. "Not as an artist, but as a human being?" I take a long breath. No matter how big the stage is, no matter how loud the screams are, I just want people to remember that I loved sincerely, that I tried to make others happy, and that even if I was hurting sometimes, I still cared. Someone in the audience quietly sniffles. Another wipes away tears. It's subtle but visible. Jimmy, who's trying his hardest to keep composure, speaks again. "People don't just love you because you are talented, they love you because of this who you are." I feel my heart clench. For years, I sometimes wondered if people loved only the version of me on stage, but hearing those words on national TV makes something inside me feel understood. Jimmy takes a moment, then suddenly grins. "But if we cry again, Hulu's going to charge extra, so we better lighten the mood." The whole room bursts into laughter, including me. And for the first time tonight, I feel truly relaxed. The band starts playing a playful melody as Jimmy says, "Now, before we wrap up, Taehyung brought something really special today." I nod, and the screen behind us turns on. A clip plays me in the studio recording, smiling, joking with the staff, looking genuinely happy. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, it's real. Jimmy asks, "Why did you choose this clip?" I answer honestly, "Because people see the performances, but I want them to see the joy too. I'm not just pain and pressure, I'm also laughter, friendship, and music." The video finishes and the audience applauds not wildly, but warmly, the kind of applause that feels like a hug. As the show starts moving toward its final act, Jimmy leans just slightly toward me, not enough for the camera to catch, but enough for only me to hear. "Thank you for trusting me tonight," he whispers. I reply just as quietly, "Thank you for seeing me." The cameras return to the wide shot. The lights blaze bright. But inside, despite the noise and the stage, I feel calm. For the first time in a very long time, I feel like I was not Taehyung the idol. I was Taehyung the person, and the world didn't turn away. As the cameras dimmed and the music of the Tonight Show faded into silence, I sat there for a moment longer, trying to absorb everything that had just happened. It wasn't just an interview, it wasn't just another appearance on television. It felt like the world had stopped for a second long enough for two human beings, Jimmy and I, to talk with no masks, no scripts, no expectations, just honesty. When the show wrapped, the audience gave one last round of applause. But it didn't feel like applause for a performance. It felt like support, like understanding, and maybe like healing. People stood up, some still teary eyed, and I realized something important. Sometimes someone just needs to go first. One person chooses to open up, and suddenly everyone else feels safe to feel something too. As I walked off stage, one of the staff members placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for sharing your heart tonight. A lot of people needed that." I smiled, but inside I was overwhelmed. For so long, I thought I needed to stay strong, stay composed, stay perfect, but maybe showing vulnerability is another kind of strength. In the dressing room, I finally exhaled. I looked at myself in the mirror, not Taehyung the artist, not Taehyung the idol, but just Kim Taehyung. A man who loved deeply, who worked hard, who sometimes hurt quietly. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not for the stage persona, not for the headlines, but for who I really am. I thought about ARMY. I thought about my members. I thought about the people who worry about me, who cheer for me, who hope I'm doing okay, even when I don't say much. I wish they could have been in the room tonight, not to watch the show, but to feel what I felt, to know that their love has reached me in ways deeper than they'll ever understand. Pain doesn't disappear just because you smile, and happiness doesn't vanish just because life gets heavy. Both can exist at the same time, and that's what makes life human. Tonight reminded me of that. Somewhere along the way, I realized that the world didn't fall apart when I opened up. People didn't pull away. They came closer, they didn't judge, they listened. And maybe that's the real miracle, not the fame, not the awards, not the stages, but the moments when hearts recognize each other without pretending. Before I left the studio, Jimmy came up to me one more time. He hugged me and said, "Whenever you feel alone, remember that tonight showed millions of people how human you are, and they loved you more for it." I didn't know how to respond, so I just hugged him back and let the words stay warm inside my chest. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I looked up at the sky. No cameras, no lights, no noise, just me. For a moment, I whispered to myself, "I'm doing my best, and that's enough." Maybe someone watching this video needs that reminder too. Maybe you've been trying to stay strong for everyone. Maybe you've been afraid to show when you're hurting or overwhelmed. I hope this story reaches you the way that moment reached me. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to have everything figured out. You just need to be human, and that's already enough. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for allowing me to be myself. Whether you're watching this from your bedroom, on the train, at work, or somewhere far away, I want you to remember one thing. You are loved, you matter, and you don't have to carry everything alone. This is Taehyung, and from my heart to yours, good night. Until next time.